My grandfather was a survivor of the Titanic. I now know the horrifying reason it sank. Whenever I asked my grandfather what happened on the Titanic, he'd start panicking and shout at me, telling me never to bring it up again. I'd never seen him act like that before. It was like he was scared of something. I figured it was just PTSD, but I would soon find out that the real reason was so much more horrifying. The first time I asked, with his hands violently shaking and his voice cracking, he made me promise never to tell anyone that he survived. He was worried people might think he was crazy. I sat there dumbfounded as he started telling the story. I was only 7 years old when I climbed on board the Titanic. It seemed so gigantic compared to me, and I was struck by how beautiful everything looked. It was one of the happiest moments in my life, as I had never felt such exhilaration. Despite how happy I was, however, deep down I couldn't lose this feeling that something about the Titanic was horribly wrong. The second day is when things started to go wrong. I began to notice some strange behavior from some of the other passengers on board the Titanic. They seemed to be coughing a lot and their eyes were very red. My father assured me that it was nothing, but I can remember how frightened he looked. He left for a few minutes and came back carrying a wrench and told me it was just for protection. I was awoken the next morning by screams coming from the next room. I jumped out of bed and rushed to see what was happening. There was already a group of people standing outside the door, and I pushed them out of the way to get a better view. I froze while staring at the contents of the room. There was a man lying on the floor with his stomach ripped open while his two young children seemed to be feasting on his intestines. I was shoved out of the way as two of the crew rushed in. They grabbed the children and struggled to hold them as the children were like rabid animals. They managed to subdue the children by knocking them out cold. We were ushered back to our rooms so that they could clean up the mess. I wandered the ship for the day and noticed that a lot of people seemed to be very sick. The crew told everyone that the sickness spreading around had nothing to do with the cannibalism that was happening, and that there was no need to panic. They were so wrong. I was awoken on the fourth day by screams and running from outside the cabin. I peeked outside and was shocked as the hallway was covered in blood and bodies were spread out throughout the floor. I quickly closed the door and went to wake my parents, but I noticed they were missing. I didn't know what to do as I was afraid to leave the room, but was afraid to be by myself. My rumbling stomach finally convinced me that I needed to leave and find some food. I crept to the door and peeked out and was relieved to find the hall empty. There were distant sounds of the engines rumbling and the occasional scream. I remembered that there was a kitchen down the hallway which would probably have something in it I could eat. It took an eternity for me to move down the corridor as I was trying to avoid stepping in blood or blood-stained clothes. I reached the kitchen and almost puked while gazing at the corpses inside. They looked like someone had stabbed them hundreds of times. They appeared to be a mixture of crew members and passengers. I grabbed any food that was close at hand and fled. I quickly ate the food that I had acquired and began to search the ship. I kept coming across more corpses along each corridor. Many of them looked like they had their stomachs ripped open. It was beginning to get dark, and I was starting to get worried that everyone else on board was dead. I rounded a corner and my bladder let loose as a gun was pointed in my face. I stood there shaking as one of the crew gazed at me for a few moments. He put the gun away before rushing off and leaving me standing there alone. It took me a while to gather my senses, and by this time it was completely dark. I had heard distant gunshots in the direction the crew member had run and wondered what he had shot. I was thrown to my feet as a deafening crash rocked the ship. I ran to the side and gazed out at an enormous lump of ice which we must have crashed into. Lumps of ice began to crash down beside me and I had to move away to avoid being hit. I watched the piece of ice disappear off into the distance and wondered how bad the damage was. I heard a noise behind me and was instantly relieved to see my father. I began rushing towards him but stopped after seeing his clothes were covered in blood. His eyes locked on mine and I began to shrink back as his gaze was that of an animal and not a human. He let out a guttural growl and then began to charge at me. I felt my bladder release once again as I awaited my death. My father suddenly went flying backwards and I turned around to discover the same crew member from earlier still clutching the gun. He looked at me for a few moments and told me to follow him. He told me his name was Arthur and that he was desperately trying to find his son who was missing. He was moving very quickly and I was barely able to keep pace. He was peeking around every corner and we walked by dozens of corpses. We eventually reached an area with a large number of survivors. Some were attempting to lower the lifeboats while the others were trying to fight off the other passengers who seemed to want to eat them. Our lifeboat was the last to be lowered, and in the process of trying to get in, we were overrun by the infected. Arthur immediately began firing off and taking out as many as he could, ensuring that everyone got into the lifeboat safely. In the midst of it all, we heard a boy screaming from nearby. I ran with Arthur to investigate, and immediately we both knew who it was. It was his son. Arthur told me to grab his hand and run back to the lifeboats. He said he would hold them off and meet us there. As we were running, I heard the screams of Arthur as he was torn to pieces. He had saved us but lost his life in the process. They managed to get the last lifeboat down and evacuated the last of us remaining survivors. Our lifeboat was moving away from the ship and I could see dozens of the passengers rushing backwards and forwards just attacking each other. The ship had begun to sink beneath the waves and most of the people were at the back of the ship. I turned away as I didn't want to see any more of this. We were rescued by ships a few hours later, and I found out my mother had survived on another lifeboat and we tearfully reunited. The hug we shared felt like it lasted for hours. As I was climbing the steps to the ship, I thought about Arthur and his sacrifice to save his son. He was the type of man who would do anything for the ones that he loved, and I will remember him forever.